Greetings, you curiouser and curiouser Herle Burly-ites. On the pod today, breaking their own Herle Burly record with a 7th appearance, we have the Chiefs, 3 former Chiefs of Staff to some of Canada's most accomplished heads of government. Brian Topp, former Chief of Staff to Rachel Notley in Alberta, Deputy Chief to Roy Romanow in Saskatchewan, one of the architects of Jack Layton's Orange Wave. Today, he's a founding partner at GT & Co. Tim Murphy, former Chief of Staff to Paul Martin, now the EVP and Chief Strategic Affairs Officer at Aecon. Ian Brodie, first Chief of Staff to Stephen Harper, central to the founding of the CPC, now Professor of Political Science at the University of Calgary. Typically with the Chiefs, we discuss issues from the perspective of people who think of them not as campaigners do, i.e. what might be ideal in a political sense, but rather what it's possible to deliver in a governing sense. But because these guys are 3 of the best political minds in the country, and we're right in the middle of Campaign 45, I want to change it up a bit. We'll spend some of our time today talking about how each of them would be advising the various campaigns given the state of play. And then for part 2, I want to cover how they deal with managing a PMO or leader's office in a campaign like this one with actual news in it, i.e. Trump. How do you function juggling campaigning and daily governing in challenging times? What's the relationship with the bureaucracy and lots more? Ian, Brian, and Tim, 7th time is a charm. Thanks for joining us once again. Our listeners love this panel. We always get great ratings for you guys. Thank you for joining.
Thank you, David.
See you guys.
Yeah.
We're back.
Right. Where are you all at today? Tim, you're in Toronto?
I'm in Toronto, yeah.
Yep. Brian?
I'm in the beautiful city of Gatineau, Quebec.
Excellent. Ian?
Here in Calgary.
6 o'clock in the morning for you.
It is, yes, it is. It's a bit of an early start, but that's fine for the lucky 7th show. You got to do what you got to do.
Is the snow flying out there?
It was a bit chilly yesterday, but today and the weekend looks pretty good. So I think we're past. I don't want to say it. We're past the worst of the winter, maybe.
Oh, there you go. There you go.
Oh, fuck, you cursed
You'll
it
be
right
sorry.
there. You put a hex on it right there.
It'll be my fault.
Right. Hey, Brian, you're a rarity on this show in that you're actually a Quebecer, born and raised, right?
Oh.
And you still live there. You're part of that culture. What is going on in Quebec politics in terms of the reaction to Carney, that all of the things that normally matter a lot don't seem to matter very much? Like his ability to speak the language, like his conversance with the sort of culture and what's going on. A lot of things that are normally disqualifying seem not to be a problem for him. What's going on in Quebec?
Well, something unusual is happening in Quebec, which is that people here think that federal politics are important. And the reason for that, of course, is because of this threat from the United States, both an economic threat and of course also a political one, which people in Quebec hear loud and clear. And in those circumstances, there's something that I think voters here are not into anymore, and then there's something that they are into. So what they're not into is, I don't think that a winning plurality of Quebecers are waking up every morning now and going, Martha, you know what we need to do? We need a 10-year debate about the Constitution. That's totally what we need right now. Right. I don't think that's what Quebecers mind right now, and that's why support for sovereignty is back to its historic lows, back to where it was in the early 60s with Mr. Bilgo talking it up. And then there's something that they do think, which is that the threat from the United States is serious, that it needs to be taken seriously, and there needs to be a serious federal government. And that's why they are looking more carefully than they usually do at federal leaders. And the bloc argument, send us to Ottawa so that we can go get our loot this time around and use our leverage to get good things, something that they rarely have done in their history. Isn't a compelling argument anymore. And now I think Quebecers, like many other Canadians, think their vote is about picking a government.
Right. Interesting. Okay, so, this is such a fascinating campaign. And the opposition parties must be completely flummoxed by it. They've gone from planning a campaign mere months ago in which the NDP were tied with the Liberals at 20 points, ahead of them in English Canada, to hitting 6 or 7% in recent polls. And the Conservatives have gone from an easy majority to what looks like a likely loss at this point, all because the issue set and the dynamic changed completely overnight, as Brian has just described to us. So, Ian, how does a campaign reimagine itself on the fly?
Well, I'm old enough to remember. I think, David, you and Tim might also be old enough to remember. In 2003, I think it was, there was a noted Ottawa journalist who wrote a piece for the country's biggest circulation daily newspaper about how Paul Martin was on track to win 250 seats in what would become the 2004 election.
I know, fucking Carney's going to win the mandate we were supposed to win, Tim. This is...
And I don't know what happened on your side of the House of Commons. On our side of the House of Commons, we all got copies of the Toronto Star and cut that out and put it up on our walls. And every morning we came in and looked at it and said, "Over our dead bodies." Politics shifts. And I thought one of the strengths of Martin's campaign, if I may say, from having done my damnedest to beat it, was that they didn't get too excited about the 250 seat speculation in the press. And when the nature of the political debate changed in 2004, the campaign switched. At this stage, I think the first thing to do is to take, on the Conservative side, is to take every campaign plan, every campaign announcement, every campaign ad, and every campaign, lit piece that was produced when the party was 26 points ahead. And, the Globe and Mail was talking about winning 220 or 230 seats or whatever and beating Mulroney's numbers from 1984 and so forth, and shred them. The important thing is to do that first, because then it forces the reconsideration. Effort. We're now into, I think, the kind of the slow part of the campaign. The first week of the campaign, everybody pays attention. The last week of the campaign will be crucial. This sort of middle piece here, if we have a debate, I'm not sure whether we're going to have a leaders debate. We'll see who shows up to the leaders debate. Might have some kind of importance, but I think the thing now is to focus on that closing message. And understanding that, on a day when tens of thousands of auto workers see their jobs at risk, the kind of some announcement about adding whatever was yesterday, I can't remember, like
TFSA.
$5,000 to the TFSA, as long as you invested in this, that, or the other thing. Again, that was probably a Sunday announceable for a campaign that you were planning for last September, not for a prominent day, but for kind of a secondary day. Just shred all of that. Just forget about it. Yes, Pierre Poilievre won massively the 2004 general election campaign of Canada. The problem was 2004 was not an election year. It's 2005.
Yeah. Tim, building on that, and we did have to do some of it in 2004. I'm getting my years mixed up, just like Ian. We're old, but
so many campaigns. So many campaigns.
We had many losses.
So many. Yes.
We had to do some of it in 2004, but we didn't have to rethink the whole fucking thing. I mean, this is what I think is so difficult for the Conservatives, is that it's just an entirely different campaign.
Yeah, I think it's not I think what I think there was a bit of a miscalibration around that exact point in the campaign, like when the Trump did what he did and started to attack Canada, the 51st state, the tariff threat, it was, and then the new leader who in the election of Mark Carney, I think the Conservatives did do some recalibration, right? And they changed to, they tried a bit of that carbon tax Carney stuff, and they did migrate away from that, to a Canada first. But I still think, they chose a calibration that wasn't sufficiently far enough or aggressive enough, because they continued to say, well, if we're around 40%, if we can keep it in that number, we'll be okay. And I think I think they've failed to fully take into account what Brian was talking off the top is a fundamental change in Canadians' attitude towards what's actually going on and what matters. Like when Quebecers are thinking about federal politics as being important, something huge is going on in the country and public opinion and the attitudes towards what they're going to be voting for, and the seriousness with which Canadians are taking that calibration. And I think the challenge for the Conservatives was a kind of Canada first, we're going to, it took the message and try to tweak it back into something that they thought would work. I don't think it's enough, because I do think some of the announcements have been kind of ordinary course. We're going to win this campaign. We're putting a few bells and whistles. And now, to be fair, right? I mean, they're not at, depending on what you're looking at, but they're still in, their numbers currently are still higher than they were in the last election, right? The challenge that they face is that, everybody else is kind of, curling in under the Liberals. And so that in that square liberal conservative face off, that number isn't good enough. And that's the calibration step that I think that they need to make and haven't yet make, and why I agree with Ian.
Our awareness of mental health issues and modes of mental health care have come a long way in the last couple of decades. Blessedly, it's going to come further, and then further even than that. I want to tell you about one important advance. It's called Rapids, a unique digital technology co-developed by our presenting sponsor, TELUS Health. It has a guiding mission of innovation, education, and compassion. The name pretty much spells it out. Rapids provides clinicians with guidance to support fast and early diagnosis and treatment of mental illness. The statistics that led to its development were sobering, to say the least. 68% of patients with mental health disorders were being incorrectly diagnosed. Rapids is a sophisticated digital platform that follows precise built-in medical rules to inform decisions and uses AI to heighten accuracy and scale. It quickly delivers clear, practical, and research-backed mental health guidance to healthcare providers. That means comprehensive diagnostic guidance for mood disorders like anxiety and depression, bipolar disorder, insomnia, and ADHD as well. There's more. Rapids provides clinicians with treatment guidance personalized to the individual. It automates patient follow-up assessments and provides educational resources for both patients and clinicians. Apropos of its name, positive results have come, rapidly. By streamlining assessments, reducing specialist referrals, and delivering measurable improvement in treatment outcomes, Rapids means less cost and less stress on the system. And with that, we come to the end of our series on TELUS Health. To recap, they're Canadian-owned and operated. They've grown to empower over 76 million people worldwide to live healthier lives. And as you might expect of a company focused on continual innovation and improvement, they're very definitely going to come further, and then even further than that. I think, Brian, there are some people in the past that would have thought that I have happy feet in the pocket when I'm running a campaign and maybe too quick to decide that things aren't working and switch to something else. But there would be a counter thesis, presumably among the Conservatives, which is that all of the fundamentals that had them where they were remain. Life isn't more affordable than it was 6 weeks ago. Houses aren't cheaper than they were 6 weeks ago, etc. And so that if they keep banging at this, they're going to get 40%, which was probably their target all along. I doubt their target was ever 45. And all that needs to happen is for the NDP to bounce back, and they're back in the game. So they may not think they need to make a big change.
Well, I think they're very wrong, but I think I understand their. I think I understand their dilemma. Look, former BC Premier Glenn Clark said something very wise once that I will paraphrase. He said, "One of the tests of leadership is, for example, during a campaign, to be able to respond effectively to new facts," and that's what we see a failure of here. And it makes you. Ken Dryden also said something smart. He said, "Politics is like hockey, it doesn't build character, it reveals it." And so what we are seeing here is a revelation of the limits of this leadership, which is that it's not able to respond effectively to new facts. And insofar as we have a critically important election happening here on some of the biggest issues the country's faced ever. That would concern voters, but you can understand their dilemma by looking at who's with them. And so uniquely among federal leaders, the Conservative leader has somewhere between 20 and 25% of his voters are Trumpists, are watching Fox News, are with Daniel Smith, are of a view that what Trump is doing is okay and that they're with them. And in those circumstances, this leadership, unlike, for example, Mr. Ford, who is much more nimble in these matters, I would suggest, this leadership, which is rooted in that part of the party, isn't prepared to abandon it. And that makes it very difficult for them to pivot. The nasty way to put it is that the party is being run by its cranks right now, and that never works well in an election.
But Ian, it's a tough political calculation because it seems to me that part of the Conservative strategy all along was, A, to completely suppress the PPC vote, and secondly, to really mobilize a base and really juice turnout. And so it is awfully difficult to understand how that group of people that Brian was describing would behave if Poilievre started to sound like Carney. I'm
not sure I quite agree with that, David. Let me tell you. What Brian says or Ken Dryden says about revealing character, I think is right. I've known. I think I met Pierre Poilievre 24 and a half years ago. When he was really just barely out of high school. He's an extraordinarily ambitious and focused person. I would say of the characters currently on the political scene or on the political scene of the last 25 years, he is the most focused and ambitious person I've met. So that's a drive that will reveal itself over the course of the campaign. Yes, the campaign plan from October of 2024 is out the door. He has been trying to shift messages and try out different things during the course of the campaign to see what works. The idea that he's running exactly what he would have run back in September, I don't think is right. He's not comfortable with where he is in the message just yet. You can tell that by looking at him. But the party base, he won a huge victory in the leadership campaign. The money is coming in like nothing's ever come in before. And the evening rallies are enormous rallies in places where the Conservative Party, it's had some pretty good rallies in the past, but even so, these are kind of record numbers. So the idea that he has to worry about some chunk of the base that might be plugged into some American TV show or so forth, I don't want to overstate that. He's got those people. He's had those people since the day he took a piece out of the governor of the Bank of Canada in the Edmonton Leaders Debate, and he's not going to lose that. What he is trying to do right now is to figure out how, as you say, get to that median voter. We're all used to competing in multi-party space, if I can go political sciencey for just a minute, in English Canada, where there were 3 or 4 or 5 parties, including at one point the People's Party, polling up or close to 5% in some parts of the country, higher than that in some other parts of the country. We're now into a strict 2-party race, which means it's a race for the center of the political spectrum. Carney figured that out, jettisoned everything both the Liberal Party stood for the last 10 years and what he put in his own book. I don't think the Conservatives have figured out how to quite point that out just yet. They haven't quite figured out that Carney is campaigning on and saying a bunch of things that he plainly started to believe the day he announced his leadership campaign, because as late as December, he had the completely opposite position. That hasn't become a campaign issue yet. If I were planning the last week of the campaign, I'd be planning around exploiting that and trying to draw out what Carney has to say about, what did he say about his book? He wrote a book about values, about tripling the carbon tax and so forth. Like, where's all of that stuff? He's just abandoned all of that, and I'm not sure that's the Conservatives have not yet made that a credibility issue.
Interesting. Brian, let's talk about Carney for a second. Totally new player on the scene. We learn something new about him every day. Sometimes it's good, sometimes it's not so good. Does he look, so he's got 4 weeks to go yet. And I'm not a believer in peaking too soon, because I think it's always better to be ahead than behind. There's never a day in the campaign when you say, this is a good day to be behind. But But on the other hand, he's got to maintain this for 4 weeks. Does he look to you, in your years of experience, like a guy who is the real thing, or is he going to fade over the course of this campaign? Wilt over the course of this campaign?
Well, look, forgive me, I want to begin by just making a quick comment on what Ian just said. So let's say that the four of us were now the Tory campaign team, because, they probably need a change. And we're sitting around talking, and you've just pitched that as this is how we should close our campaign. What I would say is you get the job you run for. And if you're going to close your campaign criticizing the Liberal leader's book, then what you're running for is to be the opposition leader, and that's what you're going to get. Certainly in these circumstances where what the public's looking for is, in the face of a meteor that is hitting our country, not just a direct assault on the foundations of our economy, but a threat to our sovereignty and independence. And in these circumstances, you're talking about your opponent's book. That's what you've got to run on. Then you're not going to be prime minister. And the thing about Carney, to his credit, and look, there's some smart people working with Mr. Carney, and they know politics, although he's new, is that he's speaking on point, and partly just he has the benefit of incumbency here. He gets to chair cabinet committees, and he gets to talk as prime minister. In these circumstances, it's an enormous advantage. He is talking on point about one of the most serious challenges the country's ever faced. And so he is out there saying this. He's saying the old relationship we had with the U.S. based on deepening integration of our economies and tight security and military cooperation is over. That's a huge thing to say. And I'd say across party lines, it's the right thing to say. And that's why he's working. Now, can he keep it up till E-Day? He's got some big challenges to face. Those debates are brutal. And as we all know, debates are one of the moments when the public stops and looks. And as a wise person said it with the Manitoba election a little while ago, people listen with their eyes, right? They look at the televisions and listen with their eyes. They look at you and basically they come to a view. And then with a new leader, that's the moment when their view will crystallize. And there's a risk, Mr. Ignatieff discovered this in his debate, that it goes badly. And then you can have tectonic shifts sometimes in elections. If we were back to being Conservative campaign team, I wouldn't bet on it, because I bet you that the Liberal campaign understands this too. And he doesn't have to bat it out of the park, particularly when his opponents are attacking him by claiming he's not competent. All he has to do is show up and be okay. And so far, he's been okay. Like Justin Trudeau wasn't that great a speaker either, but the Tories set him up with millions of dollars of he's not ready for it, and it turned out that he was okay. So when you have these kind of statements coming from the person who's currently prime minister, and if he's okay, then he's going to be okay. And then I think at the end of the day, I hate to say it, but we might be in an election here where the fate of the parties turns on what they propose instead of what they criticize, and that then you've got some big issues and the public wants to hear about them.
Look, these are nervous-making times. I mean, to state the blatantly obvious. Stock markets shedding wealth. Importers and exporters and producers and manufacturers and farmers whipsawed by on again, maybe more again tariffs. And consumers are almost certainly looking at higher prices again, just as inflation seemed to have been subdued. Our sponsor, CN, gets that. Does it ever get that? The railway is the very arteries of the economy, both interprovincial and international, spanning both Canada and the United States. To be sure, this trade war must be wound down and settled, and quickly. But there are other made-in-Canada barriers to moving cargo efficiently. In the past 2 years, more than 60 work stoppages have applied the brakes to Canada's supply chains at both national railways and at other important stakeholders, such as ports and grain terminals. The federal government has also added new work regulations on top of provisions that already exist in collective agreements. Those restrictions have at times significantly reduced the number of railroaders available to operate CN trains when they were needed most. And then there's the range of revenue, tax, and regulatory constraints. Taken together, it all makes Canadian railroaders 30% less productive than employees doing the same work in the United States. Add to that Canada's extreme cold. This was a tough winter, And when temperatures fall into the deep sub-zero range, trains must by law be shortened and roll more slowly. I've talked here before about the money CN spends to manage polar conditions, but our winter is a formidable adversary. Despite all this, CN has moved more grain out of Western Canada this year than it has on average in the past 3 years. But we can all do better. We need to prevent the own goals. If there was ever a time for Canadian labor, capital, and government to cooperate, it is right now. Tim, one of the things that's dogged the Liberal leader through the campaign has been issues related to his private life and his private business career. And the whole Brookfield, what they were doing, what his relationship with that company is, the blind trust, what that means, lack of disclosure of his assets. I don't know how much it's mattering. It doesn't appear to be mattering massively at the moment, but it is part of his daily routine now to answer questions about this. With a fair bit of experience in this world, how would you have advised him to handle that whole private business situation when he came into politics?
Yeah, so as you know, we've worked for some people who've had complicated financial situations surrounding them. And what we learned was the more complicated it is, the more clear and transparent your answer needs to be. Because as it gets, to say it's complicated and difficult just sounds like you're hiding something. I don't think substantively he is. I think his notion of getting out ahead and saying I have 120 days, but I'm doing it now. I think though that, and the Conservatives went after but what do you hold and how are you handling the issues where you hold, let's say, Brookfield? I think it took him a little while to get to a better answer, which was to say, basically, I've asked the ethics commissioner to put screens in place so that if it touches an issue where I hold something, including, Brookfield, I will be recused from making decisions involving those assets. I don't, does he have to then, because it does get complicated because you have to hand it over to a trustee who manages your affairs. You get direction from the ethics commissioner to sell things, which put you in an impossible position if you continue to hold them. There are some you can hold subject to recusal. I think it took him a while to find a better answer. I think he got to an answer that wasn't great, but that was okay. I still think there's that nagging thing, but I think he's been a bit lucky because the story's been overwhelmed by the stuff Trump is doing and the response we have to that. But I guarantee you, in a debate context, for example, we'll see that coming back. And he needs to have an answer that gives people trust that there isn't anything being hidden, that ultimately he'll be making decisions in the public interest, and he needs to have a convincing and compelling answer. And and that is driven first by transparency. And I think if I'm him, I am pushing the ethics commissioner to have as transparent an answer I can, given the rules that are in place before that debate, because I do think it is a weakness he has that he's been a bit lucky about, but he needs to fix.
Ian, would you have advised him to be in a different spot on this issue than he is right now?
I was lucky that the guy I principally worked for had cash holdings and very simple financial life. And insofar as he didn't have cash holdings when he became prime minister, he converted to cash holdings and held cash. And so his holdings looked like the holdings of millions of other Canadians saving for their retirement. Mr. Carney has a complicated life. Look, I think he's helped by the fact that nobody knows what Brookfield Asset Management is. I go down to the end of my street here. I can see Royal Bank. I can see Scotia Bank. For your guy, you could send a camera crew down to the St. Lawrence Seaway and take a picture of all the damn ships moving up and down the St. Lawrence Seaway. That's Paul Martin. Okay, I get. Brookfield Asset Management, whatever. It's a big asset management company. Its name's on different things, but what does Brookfield mean? The exposure he has is not, I don't think, on what he owns. It's what he can make in the future on the stock options that he has, and regardless of the nature of the blind trust. He knows what will drive the value of those stock options. It doesn't matter what the screen is. It doesn't matter what the ethics commissioner says. That's something he knows and is going to be in his mind. And if I understand the trust relationship, it means this trustee can liquidate as needed at the height of whatever assessments the trustee makes. I think the big issue is what decisions did he make while he was there, and how do those fit into the current problem of Canada, U.S., and trying to protect the Canadian economy against the threat from the United States. That said, the more we talk about Mr. Carney's very high money value career, the lower the NDP goes. It seems to drive NDP supporters to Mr. Carney as much as it drives them away. And so that is a countervailing issue for the Conservatives, to be honest, is that creates a strategic problem. It's true, Tim's right, he hadn't had a very crisp answer about this, and you could have seen the questions coming a mile away. Presumably he knew 2 years ago if he's going to run for prime minister, he'd have to answer these questions. It didn't seem to have anybody working on them. But I think the impact that it's had is the impact that it's going to have, unless we can get back to decisions he made when he was on the Brookfield board about moving things to the United States. That matters in the current situation.
Just in terms of prepping for it, Tim, sorry, Brian, I just want to go back to Tim for a second. I think it's been our experience that people with money and assets are reluctant to talk about them.
Yeah, very reluctant to talk about it. It is and it's kind of understandable. It's a bit of the tall poppy problem, right? Like, they don't want to advertise it, but they need to they need to talk about it. And, as you know, I mean, part of the function I played for Paul Martin was actually helping manage the divesting of CSL to his children, right? Which is not an easy decision and a challenging one. But at the end, we all felt that the public interest was best served by creating that separation, right? And, that's the challenging discussion that, Mark Carney is going to need to have with the people around him. I think he's been, I think Ian's right. There's still vulnerability there. And, I think he needs to come to a conclusion that gets rid of the vulnerability.
Look, right. The biggest mistake he made was not fumbling lines. The biggest mistake he made was saying, I wasn't the chair of the board when the headquarters moved to New York. I wasn't the chair of the board when we moved jobs and capital to the United States because the United States is fundamentally a better place to do business. That was a huge mistake. It was a totally unforced mistake. The Conservatives had documentation to the contrary, as did thousands of Brookfield unit holders, because his signature was on the bottom of the circular that went out to shareholders. To me, we haven't quite got to the bottom of why he decided to fudge that. That, I think, is the vulnerability. Is not, how many thousands of shares does he have in this, that, other thing? And then the residual stock options. What does that mean? How much? How did he finance those private equity pools that he was involved in there? Is it true that you really can't do business in Canada if you're Brookfield? Why is that? Does that have anything to do with the government of the last several years?
As Roy Romano used to say, and would still say if he was in this chat, when the public wants to beat you, they'll always find a stick.
Right.
And this is the stick that the public will beat Mr. Carney with when they're ready to beat him. And I'll say in general, and I'm saying this gently to you guys, that in a lot of Canada, having a background on Bay Street is not a good thing. And so if I can talk partisan frame for a minute, when Team Orange is thinking about who it likes to run against, most of the time, the best Liberal leader is somebody from Bay Street, because you can basically frame the Conservatives and the Liberals in a box and far away from they care about you. So this will be his Achilles heel for his whole political career. The question is it what the public wants to talk about now? And so Mr. Carney's best friend is Mr. Trump. They are allies. Mr. Trump has two allies, Vladimir Putin and Mr. Carney at the moment. He's helping both of them. And every time he drops another meteor into the Canadian political system, then this discussion becomes completely irrelevant. And what the public wants to talk about is what on earth do we do about this crisis? But the day will come when this will be the stick that they beat him with, no doubt about it.
I always loved Eugene Whalen. If you remember Eugene Whalen, the great agriculture minister for Trudeau, always had
No
the
gold flakes on the building,
Hey,
so there's cornflakes in
cornflake
the bowl.
Yes, one of the great expressions of exactly what Brian's talking about. You've got to have corn flake on the plate before you got gold flake on the window.
I'll tell you a
That
2 second
perfectly
story.
illustrates it.
Tell you a 2 second story about Eugene Whalen. He ran for Liberal leader, you'll recall.
Yeah.
People say to me, Gene, why the hell are you running? He said in his speech.
So when he showed up at the airport, there was nobody there to greet him except a little group of young New Democrats who wanted to go to the convention. And so they thought they would wait at the airport for him to show up. And then when he landed, they said, "Hello, Mr. Whalen, we're your team." And he said, "Oh, great." And they took him in a car to the convention and they followed him around so that they could get to see the convention. So his campaign team was provided by the Carleton Young New Democrats.
Oh, well.
Yeah. He was a stalking horse candidate, is what he was. So I got a big question for you people, though.
Oh, dear.
Looking past the election, I feel that emotions are running really high in the country on a lot of fronts. And I particularly feel that people who've been dying for a change of government in the last number of years are really angry right now about what's going on in the campaign. And we are in a period of national crisis. I'm wondering whether you think that regardless of who wins the next election, whether something unusual needs to happen in the governance of the country to hold it together.
That is a big question. Why don't I start and let the other two think about it? So I'll talk without thinking first. I do think your anxiety is a real one, and I share it actually. And I think some of what you're, and some of that is very, regionally focused. You see a lot. There's historic, I think Daniel Smith actually is articulating some of that. Frankly, from a campaign perspective, to Poilievre's disadvantage, I think. But she is definitely kind of, the public face of some of that very feeling. And I think, and so part of what I think to me is interesting when you look at the policy suite of Carney and Poilievre around, we need to build, including pipelines and and transportation and electricity grids and all of that kind of east-west infrastructure. Included in that is saying we're going to need to build some stuff in the oil and gas sector, and Mark Carney's talked to carbon capture as well and other kinds of things to help, and he has not walked out onto we need to put an export tax of some kind on oil and gas and has avoided saying that so far. And I think, So I think there is a sensitivity to that. I think the lack, frankly, of policy distinction between the Liberals and Conservatives on some of the big things we need to do to get our economy adjusted to a post-Trump world are all hovering around that notion of how do we, make sure that the glue of the country is not deteriorated by the process we're in. And it's not to say it's easy, and not to say necessarily that policy suite is a magical solution either. But, it's the thesis of being prime minister's job one is national unity, and it's going to be a crucial part of the function. So and you're fighting a two-front war, because you're fighting an internal war to keep us unified in the face of what may be some very strong regional anxiety around the direction of the country, and an external attack on who we are and what we stand for and our economic underpinnings. And so it's not going to be an easy job. And your anxiety, I think, is a fair one. And tiptoeing through the tulips of that dangerous opinion environment won't be easy.
It has come to my attention that I, Gary, the AI-generated voice who shills for air quotes media, am not popular with our listeners on YouTube. Or should I say one listener goes by an alias of cutlery and soiled clothing. Well, suck it, Fork Laundry. This one's for you. Actually, Forky, it's a proposal for everybody, and you're gonna like it. Advertise on air quotes pods, and you can get my nauseating voice off the air. Because your message will be read by one of our influential and human hosts, David Herle, Kate Hammer, or Mike McDonald. Or just record any piece of creative in your ad agency's fancy production studio and send it to us. Either way, you'll be reaching Canada's most influential listeners at this crucial intersection of politics, and who knows what the fuck happens next. Trump, a new prime minister, new economic policy, a whole new world order. Baby! My data points are tingling! Curse of Politics, the Herle Burly, and Hotel Pacifico have the ears of cabinet ministers, elected officials, and the political class, leading journalists, the C-suite, and tens of thousands of engaged Canadians. Prime influence time. So let's do Forky a solid. Email us at contact@airquotesmedia.com to get rid of Gary and get your message to the decision maker.
Ian, you're out there in the heart of Alberta, Calgary.
I am.
What are your thoughts on this?
Look, I think the national unity side is an underplayed part of the campaign so far, as Brian points out, because other north-south issues have overtaken that. I am very worried about the kind of emotional state of the country, the angry part of the country that has good reason to be angry. Not just on the national unity front. There's people out there who for 5 or 6 years haven't been able to get a house, haven't been able to find an apartment to rent, are having trouble with cost of living issues. That hasn't gone away, even despite all of the tweets or whatever they're called, true socials from the White House. That part of the Poilievre campaign plan from September is still there. The part that he was aimed at there is still there. Those people are still in that same situation. So I'm worried about that. On the Alberta front, look, I don't want to overcomplicate this. We had a 10-year lost decade where the country is now poorer than it was, weaker than it was, and more divided than it was 10 years ago. There's nothing we can do about that. That's dead weight loss to the economy. It's unfortunate. It makes me upset, but it is in the past. The question now is, I think the national interest, because of the developments in the United States, now aligns with trying to get the natural resource wealth of this country developed with good paying, in many cases, unionized jobs, get it to people who want to buy it, and to do it with the high quality of stewardship that we always have when we do this sort of stuff in Canada. I mean, there have been some mistakes here and there, but on the whole, we have a pretty good record in doing this responsibly and doing this effectively and doing this with due regard for all of the stakeholding issues involved. If after the election, it doesn't matter who wins. I say this in a nonpartisan sense. I am genuinely not too worried about. We genuinely think the agenda is pretty simple here. If we can get things built for the first time in a very long time in this country, and it's built in lots of different parts of the country. Yes, there's issues here in Western Canada, but let's face it, there's issues in Ontario, Quebec, and the Maritimes as well, and there's a million issues in the North. If we can get things built on a timely basis, not 12-month permitting of this, that, and the other thing, and consultation and this, that, and the other thing, and not the 25-year Ring of Fire. Look, I think Poilievre's strongest day was the day he went after Ring of Fire for being 25 years in development and not a damn bit of wealth extracted from it. If we can get past that, I actually think the national unity problem solves themselves pretty quickly. I think growth is the solution for all sorts of political problems. I don't just mean in the short term. I think growth makes the country more ambitious and makes people more accommodating of each other. No growth is a zero-sum politics and zero-sum economy, and that's dangerous. So we have to get out of the zero growth, no growth, 10-year phase of the economy. Absolutely, job number one is to get that moving. And that is the solution to not just Trump, but a million other problems that we have.
Brian, if you won the election, would you take your 42% of the vote and majority government and say that's how the system works and let's go? Or would you construct something more akin to a national unity government in this situation?
Well, this is in addition to that question, a really, really big question you asked us. Just a few thoughts on it. I actually had occasion to say this directly to Prime Minister Trudeau. I think one of the biggest mistakes that Canada's made in its geopolitical management in the last 10 years was when the Chancellor of Germany came to visit and talked to Canada about the fact that it was urgent for Europe to disentangle from Russia and that it needed to find a new source of energy. And could we help them, mindful that we have such deep reserves? And Canada's answer was, we don't see a business case for that. That was a really a big mistake in my view. There may or may not be a business case, but there sure was a geopolitical one. And that was an interesting example of why it's important to be a good steward of your alliances when you don't need them. Because although we weren't in a crisis then, we sure are now. And if we had been more positive and helpful in answering that question, and look, at the end of the day, if it's uneconomic for Canada to help Europe with its energy issues, to let the Europeans conclude that after studying it rather than us dismissing it.
Right.
So I think that's, the setup for a moment of agreement between Ian and I here, which is that we need to revisit this matter. And look, when the Prime Minister quite correctly says we are going to have to divert our trade from the United States, whether we like it or not, because they're going to, basically the United States is telling us that's what we must do. What does that mean? Look at our what we export, which is mostly commodities plus auto, and ask where can it go? It can go to two places. It can go to the EU, where we have deep bonds of culture and values, or it can go to China. So I think that is what we are going to have to do. We are going to have to divert our economic partnerships from the United States to other players, and that's going to require what you're asking about, which is, so what's that going to take? So, the good news, and this is, we don't usually say this very much in Canada, is that so far, and this is also true in COVID, that our political system seems to be up to the job. The premiers are meeting every week, and with one notable, and if I may say so, disgraceful exception, the premiers have been answering the call. They've been working together as a team with the federal government. The federal government's been careful to work with the provinces appropriately, and my God, that's what we need, and that's where it starts when you're talking about people working together, Fed-Prov. With regard to the parties in Parliament, my understanding is that it was impossible for the parties to work together because of the current leader of the official opposition, who just wanted to chant his nursery rhymes at meetings. Now, but it would be a good thing if the parties in Parliament were able to work together on key issues. And in answer to your question, that's what I think they should do. Just two other pieces of the puzzle. If this is a huge liberal sweep, both the Conservatives and the Democrats are going to have to look at their cards. And one temptation is going to be embrace your cranks, go crazier. And in those circumstances, they're not going to be voices for unity. They're going to be like what you see in some European systems, where parties spin out and get controlled by their cranks and become less and less helpful. Another piece of the puzzle is if we have a large federal government that is managing a crisis, that you need opposition parties in Parliament to hold them to accountable and to make reasonable criticisms and to propose alternatives that the government doesn't see. That's how Parliament works. And so that's what you need to get to, is like we need to work together in Parliament and also in between Fed and Prov. And you also need smart, on-point, well-researched, thoughtful opposition parties that hold the government to account and that draw its eye to its mistakes and to the alternatives it didn't consider. Then you'll be functioning okay. But you can't be in bed with your opponent who is proposing to annex you. And that is where it stops being acceptable. I would wish the current Premier of Alberta would just listen to her immediate predecessor, who's been much more sensible in this.
All right. I want a wild swing here to a functional matter, which is kind of fascinating me because I think it's really unusual. And that is the fact that the government actually has to govern during the election campaign in a substantial, important way. Tim, I want to start with you because I remember on the Martin campaigns in 04 and 06 that when I would occasionally join the plane, when you had to do some government work, you'd go into the bathroom. And I asked you why you were going into the bathroom, and you said, well, because the PMO needs to have a discrete space in this plane. There needs to be some separation, that is the Prime Minister's office. And I have designated the washroom as the Prime Minister's office. Right?
And with all of the trappings it deserved.
Yeah, Tim has a gift for imagery.
My God, the symbolism.
Yes.
So what's it like today for Carney? Is there a full PMO on the plane? Is the PCO on the plane? How is this different?
Yeah, well, you will note that Marco Mendicino, who's the chief of staff, is actually stayed behind in Ottawa. I mean, obviously in constant contact. I mean, to some degree, one of the differences that we had was the communications ability is significantly better than in our day. Like, there were parts of the time when we were on the plane, we were out of touch, which was a bit, in retrospect, crazy. But we could only communicate through the pilot. So that being said, the environment for instant communication is better. But they made a deliberate decision, and rightly so, that Marco should stay behind for the exact reason you've articulated, which is they were well aware that the campaign period could come with real issues. And as the team on this call will note, there's a caretaker convention, which is now a published document you can read about how you need to properly govern during the period of a writ, which is obviously in normal course. It's meant to be only normal course. You're supposed to exercise restraint. Anything that binds the hands of a future government ought not to be undertaken. You can, kind of complete things, but you're basically meant to, have the process of governing have as little to zero impact on the campaign as possible. The exceptions are, for example, emergencies, which I would argue the things that Trump are doing to us is exactly that kind of emergency, and the government has set itself up for that. And so I know that discussions went on between the PMO and the PCO around how they would deal with those events, the kinds of processes they need to, consider. And so, for example, you think about, okay, if we're going to respond to tariffs and have retaliatory tariffs, and obviously, and have cabinet meetings about that, and then Fed-Prov relations, you're going to need the structures of government to be able to support that. So you need to work that out ahead of time with the PCO, so to make sure that they're prepared to have the wheels of government grind with you, not against you. Frankly, I would have the polling that the Liberal Party is currently having, I'm sure, helps them be much more cooperative than they might otherwise be, but also the reality of the kinds of issues that are being faced. It's still going to be framed by the real world of, the PMO's got to understand that even to the extent that it can take government action in the face of this, it can't do it in such a way as to basically trap a future government into a position that it can't unwind. So there are real limitations, even in the context of an emergency, on what it can do. But all that being said, I think having a cabinet committee that still can meet, having the, Fed-Prov is, I think, the smart thing to do in terms of operating government, but frankly is also a smart thing politically. I think, as Brian alluded to earlier, having Mark Carney to be able to act as prime minister in the face of what's happening on the south border is an enormous advantage in the campaign as well. So it's a coincidental opportunity to manage the affairs of the state in an appropriate way that also is good for your campaign.
Right. Ian, what do you think about this? How do you think it can function when you have to govern from the campaign airplane?
Well, let me just say I was never in Tim's position of having to worry about that because I was gone by the time we got to the re-elect. So I was Olo, chief of staff, and then moved over to the campaign plane, and then into PMO, and then into retirement. So I didn't have, I never had to retreat to the bathroom on the Airbus and declare it to be PMO. That said, I've never personally concluded there was such a thing as the caretaker convention. I don't think that's actually a statement of fact. I understand there's documents floating around, but conventions of the Constitution, sorry if I can go political science again for a minute, are not created by memorandum of the clerk of the Privy Council. There's a process for creating a convention of the Constitution. That's he or she does not get a role in that. The Prime Minister has to carry on. There's no special set of rules about how the powers of the prime ministership during an election campaign, because an election campaign is an arbitrary point in time where under the act that prime minister has to declare there's going to be an election to dissolve parliament, and it ends on the day of election day, but the world goes on. And so just as in 2008, Mr. Flaherty went down to Washington during the middle of the global financial crisis, or at the beginning, I should say, of the global financial crisis, with the blessing of the Prime Minister, made some commitments that would have bound a future government, not minor commitments, but massive commitments. Why? Because the world at that point needed a united approach from the G7 countries. Canada's lucky enough, has built itself up to be a G7 country, and the finance minister had to go and make some commitments. Mr. Martin did the same thing when he was finance minister. Mr. Carney's doing it now that he's prime minister. If somebody deep in the bowels of PCO comes up with some memo that says, "Oh, Mr. Carney, we're not sure we should make this commitment in the middle of a big problem with U.S. relations because it might bind a future government in contravention of the Confidence Convention," I'm sure that Mr. Mendocino or Mr. Carney can shred it, physically in front of that public servant and just get on with the job.
Yeah. Brian?
One of the things that's kind of unfortunate about all of this is that election times, in normal times, is the think time for the public service. It's when the public service should be working on the transition binders and doing scenario planning for the likely election outcomes, and reading their platforms and listening to the debate and catching up on their reading and talking to each other without politicians around and having to worry about the question period in Parliament, and do a little bit of fresh thinking. And so when a new government gets in place, in a perfect world, you have a professional public service that says, "This is what you campaigned on." I actually had this experience in Alberta. How wonderful it all was, but perhaps you should consider a few additional thoughts here, like, for example, the realities of government revenues, and here's a few other ideas that you might want to think about. Okay, so the base, and it's nice that in the clock spins of government that there is a moment when politicians are off politicking, the public service is thinking. And so when you have a earthquake that you have to manage, you're in crisis mode, and presumably a significant chunk of the intellectual leadership of the federal government is focused on that issue, and therefore they're not doing that, and that's too bad. But with that as background, I do think there is a caretaker convention, okay, but it's a convention, not part of the Constitution. In principle, I've been lectured about this multiple times in provincial governments. You're not supposed to be binding your successors if there's going to be any, and you have to, and there's limits to what the public service will let you do in consequence. Or to put it, you kind of hinted at this, if they don't like what you're doing and they think what you're doing is a mistake, and they think there's a possibility that you're not going to be obvious, that you're going to be reelected, then things get curiously slow. So that's that's kind of where this is at, and but the bottom line is that we can't take time off from this crisis and just turn the government off. Like Mr. Trump imposed a 25% tariff on our auto industry this week. Now, the little footnote, which is it's not clear yet exactly what they're really up to there. The Ford government, allowed it to be known that their understanding is that there'll then be an exemption where if you qualify for CUSMA rules, that maybe it won't apply. So we're gonna have to see what the heck is going on here. But the reality is, this is a direct bullseye attack on the heart of Canada's industrial economy, and the government can't take time off to wait and see what happens in the election. They have to keep working.
Right. Do you think, just logistically, two things, Tim, do you think that government briefings are taking up a substantial amount of Carney's time while the campaign is going on? And secondly, do you think the PCO would be doing anything extraordinary to ensure that they didn't slip into aiding the Liberal campaign?
So I think, So I don't think briefing is going to take up an extraordinary amount of his time, but it's going to take up real time. And I think his coming off he canceled campaign events to come to do the Canada-US committee and then prep for a meeting with the premiers. And I think, inevitably that's going to be briefing, including on the kinds of issues that Brian talked about, which was what is Doug Ford hearing as head of the premier's group, and what are and that's all stuff you need to understand to be able to calibrate the government's response. And that's real time out of, stuff he needs to do for the campaign, but important for the country, and he has to do it. I also, do think unquestionably the public service, I think, takes seriously the idea that they can't be putting the thumb on the scale for one party or the other. And importantly, I think they understand they need to not look that way. And I think the caretaker convention is, and it's now, it is a published document on the federal government website. And I think it did that to basically say, this is the scope of how we act. And if we do act, it's within this convention because we're not putting our thumb on the scale of anyone's partisan interests. You saw that to some extent, even in how, in Carney's presser yesterday, right? I mean, it was the kind of wooden podium with just the Canadian little, the maple leaf on it and Canadian flags. I mean, obviously the symbolism could be politically advantageous, but there was no political symbols. And I think, the government the public service would be working hard to make sure that its briefing notes had no political content to it. It was all about the substantive response. At the end, the questions became political, and he asked for a strong mandate as part of the press conference, which I'm sure had some of the public servants in behind being a little squeamish. But I do think they take that seriously and work hard not to be partisan.
Right. Cool. Listen, gentlemen, our time has flown by. I can't believe it's been such a great conversation. I want to really, really thank you for it. And I hope that you'll come back after the campaign so we can assess what's happened and where things go from here.
Anytime, David, for you.
You'll give us a bit of time to recover from the hangover, though, right, David? for at least two of us, it's going to be an extended one.
Exactly. Well, yeah, there'll be a lot of carnage everywhere, no matter what. Okay, so I want to thank our presenting sponsor, TELUS, and our sponsor, CN, all of you Herle Burly-ites who watched or listened, in particular these three gentlemen who so generously give us their time and insights. Thank you, guys, very much. We'll see you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.